Hello everyone, Punchy here, and I have played a new horror game recently. Bloober Team's Cronos the New Dawn, and I'm gonna leave with my opinion up front. It's alright, it's okay, but I think it's okay in a way that's interesting. It gives me a lot to talk about. Like, I also played Metal Gear Solid Delta recently, and that doesn't give me anything to talk about. That is a game that you could pay £70 for if for some reason you wanted to massively overpay for Metal Gear Solid 3, a game you can buy on Steam for 16 quid. No idea why you do that, but you can. That's my review of Delta. See, you get two on this episode. What a bargain. Cronos is a third-person action horror shooter of an extremely typical sort. The closest point of comparison here, because let's be honest, this is clearly what they are imitating, is Dead Space. This is Bloober's Dead Space, down to them also having the stomp attack in it for some reason. Albeit, while Dead Space presented an interesting twist on the third-person shooter formula by making it so you had to cut off limbs and had a whole weaponry that interacted with that in various ways, Bloober Space does not. Like, no frills, no real fancy central gimmick here, just point the gun at the enemy's head and click. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's the most imaginative thing in the world, although, don't take this as me saying the combat is bad. I'd like to lead with the strong point here, which is that I actually think the fundamental third-person shooting in this game is pretty good. It's a bit too slow off the starting block. Probably the worst part of this game is the first hour or so, when you only have one weapon. And the story is kind of vague, so you're not really sure what's going on yet. We'll get to the story later. But after a slow start, the combat really starts to cook as they introduce more weapons, more enemy varieties, interesting layouts, and scenarios to fight in. It feels like the systems are really expanding and you have a lot of choice in how you approach any given situation. Cronos' one big attempt to shake up the usual dynamic of third-person shooter games is that enemies will attempt to merge with the corpses of already defeated enemies and become very strong. So a usual methodical playstyle where you pick off enemies one at a time actually goes over quite poorly in Cronos. It's better to sort of soften up a group and then take them all out quickly. And I like how various tools in the game are multifaceted and allow you to approach that problem in various different ways. There's a limited fire grenade type weapon that allows you to burn corpses so they can't be absorbed, a mechanic pinched clearly from Resident Evil Remake. But that's alright because it's applied in a new context. The fire itself has an area of effect which allows you to use it in clever ways, like baiting enemies over to a corpse and then exterminating the corpse and the enemy at the same time with the fire. You can use it as a direct offensive attack against a group of enemies, since fire stuns enemies for a significant amount of time, or you can use it as a panic button when you're surrounded and would like everything to get off you right now. I'm of the opinion that choice is the beating heart of survival horror, and Cronos does give you a lot of ways to approach its combat scenarios. Although the weapon variety isn't anywhere near as interesting in something like a Dead Space, so I wouldn't say it's quite as expressive as that game. But what I think it does a little better than Dead Space is the sense of tension. Cronos is a pretty difficult game. Ammo is very tight at basically all times. I always feel like I was finishing encounters with nothing left. The game really encourages you to get the most out of every shot, both by not providing very many bullets in the first place, and also by having a mechanic where you can charge your shot for a little extra damage at the expense of it taking a little longer to shoot. So you can take a risk and take more time, and also do more damage. It's basic stuff, but it works well. Like, none of this is mind-blowing, but it's the fundamentals executed fairly competently. I also appreciate how Bloober does in fact seem to have learned a lesson from Silent Hill 2 Remake, and enemies don't wildly snap to you whenever they attack. Silent Hill 2 Remake had a real problem where enemies would just slide across the room to hit you if they attacked even vaguely within your postcode. This does not happen in Cronos. Which is good, because there's no block or dodge in this game, but it doesn't need it because you're supposed to control your space. You don't move very fast in this game, but you can dodge by walking out of the way if an enemy does an attack with poor lateral range. But for the most part, you're not going to be bobbing and weaving like James Sunderland was in Silent Hill 2. You need to actually control the mid-range and prevent enemies from getting close to you in the first place. If they're already in your face, you've already fucked up. The difficulty of the game felt well-tuned for me. I felt like I had to stay diligent and attentive in order to not get overwhelmed, but nothing felt too difficult. I'm sure there's some dynamic difficulty, resource allocation type thing at play. It's very common in games of this type, but it provided me with a good experience, so I would say they succeeded on this front. Now, that's a lot of nice things I've just said, but didn't I say that my opinion was that this game is just okay? So what's the problem? The problem is that while I think the fundamental core is good, I don't think it really evolves past about hour 5. Like I said, the first hour is by far the weakest because it's when both the mechanics and the story are at their thinnest, but then it gradually starts to add more mechanics, and by about hour 4 to 5, I was getting really into it. I still had no bloody clue what was going on, but I was having a good time anyway. I enjoy this type of survival horror combat. Unfortunately, Hour 5 is about where the game peaks in complexity, and Cronos is a 15-hour game. The combat scenarios don't really evolve in complexity in any interesting way, nor do new mechanics get added in order to spice things up more. The system reaches its peak at about the 1/3 mark and stays there for the rest of the game, which unfortunately makes the game a bit repetitive in the long term, something that is not helped by what feels like low enemy variety. They're basically all variants of dudes with too many arms. They all do slightly different things, but it doesn't really feel like it in the moment. And again, by about Hour 5, the game has shown you all the enemies it's going to have for the remainder of the game. There's nothing new to see. And it's a crying shame because there were definitely opportunities to open up the design space in ways that it feels like they were setting themselves up for, but just don't take the chance. For instance, after the first major area, you unlock the gravity boots, which lets you stick to walls and jump around in zero gravity and stuff. It's a mechanic also pretty clearly lifted straight off of Dead Space. But Dead Space actually made you fight in these new perspectives, which made that game more interesting because you had to dramatically reconsider how the space worked in order to successfully fight in it. Cronos never does this for some reason. Like, all the pieces are there and it just doesn't put them together. Instead, the gravity boots are mostly tedious navigational exercises where you're looking around for the next pad to jump to, which I find very peculiar because this isn't a puzzle game, and it's not even really an exploration type of game. It's a linear third-person shooter. The focus should surely have been on how to expand the core combat. But you'll very often go long stretches just kinda jumping from pad to pad, not really doing anything, while your brain slowly drifts out of your ear. This dovetails into another complaint I have, which is that Bloober Space is a 15-hour game that generously really only needed to be like 8 or something. Silent Hill 2 Remake also had this problem. They just have way too much doing nothing between the critical points. Why do these guys make games like this? Speaking of the making of games, I would be remiss not to point this out, but Cronos is in fact another Unreal Engine 5 disaster. I spent roughly the first hour of gameplay having a terrible impression made on me because it ran like crap. Bloober Team cannot use Unreal Engine 5 correctly and need to stop. You guys need to stop doing this. I had to turn the game down to its lowest settings to get an acceptable 60 FPS for the duration. There seems to be some specific setting here that's the culprit for the frame drops, but I can't be bothered to figure it out. It's not my job to do that. All I know is that every modern game I buy that runs on this fucking engine runs terribly, and I'm getting really sick of it. Figure it out, or use something else. Going back to the non-combat stuff, the one puzzle-solving spice that Bloober Space really has is that you can target these orbs and then rewind or forward time using your time beam or whatever it is. I forgot what it's called. And these are perfectly fine as like small brain teasers to break up the action. I'm not complaining that it's not all action all the time. But my problem comes that the game presents itself an opportunity to integrate that mechanic into the combat scenarios and then once again drops the ball. About the most you're ever really allowed to do with this in combat is to respawn already exploded barrels to make them explode again, and that's not unentertaining as a usage, but it's the most complex thing you can do with it. It has a roughly equivalent complexity to that, like, space rift mechanic from BioShock Infinite, and that was not a good look back then either. It's a shame because the ability to rewind or alter the space you're fighting in is fervent with possibility for interesting combat scenarios, but Bloober just sort of lack the imagination to really capitalize on it. They have the basic technical competency to execute the fundamentals of the genre reasonably well, but don't really seem to have a spark of originality of their own. They can't even stumble into the inspiration necessary to recombine existing concepts in interesting ways. As a result of this, Cronos feels a bit humdrum. Been there, done that, seen it before. It's clearly inspired by Dead Space 1 and 2, but it doesn't manage to rise above its inspiration in really any meaningful ways. If you haven't played the Dead Spaces before, I would much sooner recommend you do that. But okay, what about the story, Punchy? Oh boy, what about the story? This is where it gets fun. I should preface this by saying that the story is not bad or offensive. People are on high alert around Bloober Team's writing due to a past history of mishandling sensitive themes. There's not really any of that here. What there is, however, is a lot of confusion on the player's part and a really bizarre metaphor. So I'm gonna throw this one out here and I need you to catch it. Cronos: The New Dawn is about communism. You play as the Traveler, a faceless space marine-looking individual who awakens knowing only their purpose, to extract specific individuals on behalf of the collective. We seem to be doing this to unite their consciousness as one after some sort of apocalypse has turned everyone into flesh soup. But the collective is bathed in a red light, and the tools the Travelers use are a fucking hammer and sickle. I know people who use subtext ass game, dude. Okay, I say that, it's actually really easy to not realize what's going on here because Cronos does something that I would honestly consider to be very avant-garde if I thought they were doing it on purpose, which is that it forgoes any sort of need to establish any common ground with the player at the outset. Which is to say, you're just dropped in, and more or less left to figure out what's going on yourself, but there's a distinct disconnect with the player character in a way that's very unusual for a video game. The Traveler knows what she needs to do. You don't, and you're not going to be told. And this will continue for quite some time. This is very strange for any video game, much less a horror one. Like, consider Silent Hill 2, for instance. How does that game kick things off? James finds a letter from his dead wife. He wants to find his dead wife. It's a pretty straightforward setup, and you, the player, understand what James's goal is. It is much, much less clear for hours of gameplay what it is the Traveler thinks she's even accomplishing. For the vast majority of my playtime, I wasn't even sure if she was human. She talks to everyone she meets in such a baffling, emotionally disconnected way that I honestly thought I was playing as some kind of non-human alien for most of it. And the problem with that is that games are made by humans for humans, and playing a character who behaves so non-human makes her extremely difficult to connect with on the emotional level, or even just the literal. What is she doing and why? I do not know. This could be a very interesting way to tell a story. It's decidedly non-conventional, but I don't feel like it was done on purpose. I think they just wanted to make the narrative a puzzle box the player has to work really hard to try and solve so they can get YouTubers to make lore-explained videos out of. The end result is that it's not very engaging because it's hard to discern the literal events that are happening. Something that gets worse because of the bungled metaphor for communism interfacing with it. Yep, I'm back on the communism thing. Okay, so the player character is extracting surviving humans to the collective. But she's extracting them from everyone turning into flesh soup via some sort of unclear disease. And the game constantly reminds you it's set in December 1981, a date when martial law was imposed on Poland. And don't worry, I'm not about to turn this into a crash course on Polish history. The short version there is that it was a communism versus capitalism thing. The metaphor here is fairly clear. Humanity is fucked because there is a disease going around that turns everyone into flesh soup. That's bad, and is presumably a metaphor for communism given the historical context. Depicting communism as an amorphous blob monster that eats people isn't even new ground for horror. But then we have a problem because our main character is operating on behalf of an organization attempting to assimilate people's minds into mind soup, which is also communism? I won't spoil what the end result of that actually turns out to be in case you want to play the game for yourself, but it really doesn't square with the overall metaphor. It's very confusing. It's clear what the game wants to say. It's not that the metaphor is unclear. It wants to say communism bad. It was bad that the Soviets occupied Poland. But it really just ends up being an unfortunately kind of generic story about the importance of free will and individualism and what have you. With a lot of character drama centering around an individual we honestly don't get to see very much of over the game. So the narrative kind of ends up failing to land on either of its feet. Neither the political allegory nor the individual character drama really manages to stand up, so it just ends up being very strange instead. I've never played a horror game that's this specifically about a political ideology. Considering how afraid Bloober Team seemed to be of being perceived as having any sort of ideology whatsoever, it's honestly striking that this is one of the most political horror games I think I've ever played. It wants to say something, and if you think about it, it's pretty easy to tell what, but doesn't really manage to say it in a compelling way, nor does it really fill in the blanks on how we got here. So most people are just going to leave confused and a bit empty. Indeed, that was how I felt. I feel like I put more effort into trying to understand it retroactively than most people are going to. And even I would have a hard time literally describing what's going on sometimes. But they sure did make an attempt. It wasn't a very good attempt, but they sure did make one. And to round up my thoughts on the game, after you finish it, you do unlock New Game Plus, but this game is full of unskippable cutscenes and it's way too long, so it isn't very much fun to replay, unfortunately. Can you believe this game has unskippable cutscenes in 2025? Jesus Christ, guys. And that's Cronos: The New Dawn. A fairly competent, if a bit paint-by-numbers, action horror game, but with a completely baffling story that jumbles its own metaphor so hard it becomes difficult to tell what is even going on, let alone what it's trying to say. But I will say I am glad Bloober is moving on to original projects. You know, it's not good, but like it feels like it comes from a more personal place. And that's interesting, even if the end result is really only worth playing if you're an extreme survival horror diehard like I am and just want something to wet your whistle. This game will do that perfectly fine. It's not bad, it's just sort of there. but it's one step into a bold new direction for Bloober Team. What do you mean they're remaking Silent Hill 1? For fuck... Hey there, hope you enjoyed the review. This is me trying to use the second channel to get my thoughts out on recent releases with slightly more frequency. Hopefully I can do one of these for Silent Hill F as well when that comes out, that's pretty soon. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing, I would like to do this more often, and consider supporting the channel on the Patreon, which supports all of my endeavors, including videos like this. Alright, thank you very much. See you next time.